This is Deepa Mirchandani, founder of the Deep and Meaningful Consultancy. Welcome to the Adda, a space for better conversations. This is a snapshot of one of our group conversations with Gemma Drake, a designer, system thinker, and coach for social change. In this conversation, we explore the challenges and differences between systems thinking and design, what that means for those of us that work in social change, and how we hold spaces for multi-stakeholder systems design, particularly when they don't always necessarily agree. The rest of the conversation was held in confidence for participants to be able to share and learn together freely. Hope you enjoy it. For more information, check out www.deepandmeaningful.co/the Adda.
Just to kind of set the scene, but also as a caveat, I'll say to the group here that, I'm not saying I'm an expert in this in a way. I'm sort of it's a field I've been dabbling in and learning about, and I think it's ever changing and it's growing. So it's something that is a journey. But yeah, the terms, I think this is why I was curious to have this conversation and invite you all to the kind of table as such, is that we hear these terms more and more now, and thinking about that we engage in systems all the time, like they're all around us, but that doesn't mean that we're being systemic. So this idea that there are natural systems, there are soft systems like human relationships and families and workplaces, and there are also hard systems like mechanical systems, technical systems, but it doesn't mean that we're actually being systemic. Systemic is an intentional approach to work on what we would say like a sticky or complex problem. And just to kind of set the scene, what helped me when I kind of first started kind of exploring this is you could look at problems in three lenses. So there are simple ones like baking a cake. I'd say, you've got a recipe. You might be wanting to make a Victoria sponge cake, and you might look at the best recipe to make a Victoria sponge. You'll follow it and you'll get to the same outcome. Simple. It's a simple problem. Complicated is kind of more nuanced because there are causalities and it's linear. So a complicated problem would be like building a building, designing a building, constructing a rocket or a car. It's certainly very complicated in parts, but kind of using expertise, all the parts do go together. Now, complex, the third one, is slightly more different, though there is a kind of blurring between the two sometimes, where complex is about emergence. So in a complex system, it is ever changing. It is always evolving. It doesn't have a defined kind of body. And if you imagine a swarm of starlings kind of moving around the sky, their qualities or characteristics of the starlings are kind of evolving and changing. You couldn't draw the path that they're flying in. And there's a lovely phrase that says, a complex system is greater than the sum of its parts. So it's all about individual parts acting together. And the outcome often comes as an emergence of that. So kind of, I guess, thinking about those lenses, if that helps deeper, helps us think through, well, what's the difference? So being systemic is an approach to kind of work with those complex systems. And to give you another example, I'd say a complex system is a baby. It's evolving by the second, by the minute. You're constantly researching what to do, and you won't know everything, a new parent. And the same is said for kind of deep-rooted kind of social and environmental challenges. We know that we don't have the answers, and we know that actually it's changing. So being systemic is a conscious approach to working with, I guess, that emergence, that change, that evolution. And it's some of that is about this approach of systems thinking, which I think helps us understand that. Does that help as a start?
That definitely helps as a start. But when we're talking about, a lot of us work in social and environmental issues, and the interconnectedness of all these issues, when the tradition and the practice has been to look at them in silos, I work in education, or I work with young people. I work with social entrepreneurs. How do we make sense of complex systems when they're so interdependent and there are there's so many different characters that are coming at it with different agendas and different perspectives?
So how we make sense of it is kind of the deeper field to kind of what I'd say is systems thinking, which is thinking about the mindsets and approaches to making sense, not measuring, not kind of breaking down into parts, but making sense of what's happening. So there's a kind of lovely way of saying that, kind of systems thinking kind of provides kind of perspectives on change by focusing our attention on the underlying patterns, structures, and cycles. So when I talk about the patterns, structures, and cycles, it's really about what are the patterns? How can we make sense of the trends? And then it's also an approach rooted in being kind of deeply curious and thinking critically, but also about seeing those relationships. So there's this saying in kind of orgs language, which is organizational relationship coaching, which talks about the third entity, and it's the container around the relationships. So it's not looking at the individual parts, but looking at the container of the whole. And going back to those, deeper.
No, I was just blowing my brain.
So that kind of container, like the container of the relationship. So it's that mindset, which is the hardest things. It's thinking about, we're not going to solve the individual parts. So how do we build the container to look at those parts together, or look at the components as a whole? I think another lovely way of saying it is like, when you think about it systemically, like a third person enters the relationship, you're almost like adding someone else into the room, because you're not looking at A and B, but you're looking at what happens between A and B. So,
but then how do I think about my role within that? Because more often than not, I'm working with organizations and people who talk about, we need to change the system's broken. But the system's over there. And then you get this, you might get today, I was in a session and it was, but we are the system. But then, but are you willing to reflect on what your role is within that? Like, are you part of a problem? Are you perpetuating something? And how does that work?
Yeah, so that's the kind of deeper part of, I guess, systems thinking. It's also your role. So it's playing that kind of like, it's almost spiritual, like what's your role in this, and like what's your place in the system. So you can't other it. So you're working on a social cause in my last one, in children's charity, like we are already part of the system, we are part of the problem. So how do we see ourselves as both a enabler, but also a disabler in actually causing things? Like we have to see that we play a part. And I think that kind of mindset shift often is talked about in a way that's sort of a worldview. It's sort of like a deeper view of actually seeing the connections between how things happen. But it's a hard one because it involves that relationship aspect, so collaboration rather than silos, like understanding kind of power dynamics and patterns, and all of those things are at play in like these complex spaces, competing for work or for tender or for ideas, but ultimately it's about the relationships and how we work towards them.
But also, like if the system that we're working in is antiquated and has a rigidity to it because that's the way things have been done, how do we shift? Because if you're working towards that self-examination and the examination of the interconnected parts, particularly I'm thinking about it from a social change perspective, where you've got donors who want one thing, and I know some of you work in the investment space, so we're going to ask you about it, or you're a service provider and you've got your own perspective, and then you've got a kind of maybe a third party and they've got their perspective, in terms of that collaboration, you've got to all be okay with that self-examination and that mindset shift. And that's really hard when you're trying to change the world.
I think that's the hardest thing in honesty, and actually how you often get a pushback, or the elastic would like snap back because the organization or the place you're in isn't really ready to work in that way. And I think there's a difference between kind of saying you want to, challenge inequality and poverty or work on sticky issues, but there's also a difference in challenging the role that you play and the power that you hold. And I think that's almost a bit like straddling, I think Cassie Robinson referred to this, almost like straddling two worldviews. You're kind of working in the dominant paradigm of where we are, but also trying to like think about it from the other, which is what happens if we think about these things differently? What happens if we see it as a whole rather than as a part? And I think that's like, without sharing, examples, there are tons of frameworks and methods to kind of explore this, but it's more about the journey, because it's often about, you can't get there unless everyone is sort of stepping in. That makes sense. They're kind of stepping up.
And that's the bit that I struggle with, because I'm impatient and I want to get on with it. And so having, I guess, like patience in the process is what you're saying.
Yes, but how would you feel about, acknowledging that what happens if, because complex problems don't get solved, they can't be managed. So, it's not about saying, well, we can't do anything, but it's acknowledging that actually they often morph and change into something else. Because if you've got lots of...
You're blowing up my career here.
No, but if we all act together towards something, ultimately we can shift things in a direction. But it's that saying, you can't see everything. Couldn't see COVID coming in, so you can't predict how something else would destabilize a system of inequality. You can't fully know everything. But what you can do is, I think what Margaret Wheatley talks about so beautifully is, work within your boundary. Like you can, create change within what you have and the tools you have to hand. And often that's about being humble and seeing what you have there, as opposed to kind of working out there and othering. But it's a really challenging mindset to work with. And I think the challenging one about it is it's not what we're used to.
Yeah.
So many of you might have heard this phrase or follow kind of Sonia Lignot, pronouncing her correctly, and she wrote a great blog and has a cartoon that says, you can't survive in the jungle if you were trained in the zoo. And it's the kind of mindset of, zoos are environments we have created where we manage animals in cages and we feed them at set times. It's a system, like our education system, like our work environment systems, everything we've created to manage, complexity, when it's not like that. So when you release animals from the zoo, it's really hard to survive in the jungle. And it's very hard to bridge that difference. And I think it's often about tiptoeing between the two. It's not about one or the other, but it's really about bringing in the qualities of the jungle into the zoo and sort of,
or not
that
having
makes sense. I don't know if anyone
or not having a zoo in the first place.
Yes, but that's a different world, isn't it? We've got zoos.
And that's interesting, right? Because that's the way my head goes, right? And so what was making me smile as you were talking was, there's so much like onus put on disruptors and innovation and alternative models and alternative systems. Is that all just new chat for same? But is it, can we be disruptive then?
I mean, I'm again not the expert. I think there's language used and we often need to like lift the bonnet up to see what do we mean by that. And I think systems change is a term that's being used, and actually what you really want to do is lift the bonnet up and see like, what are we trying to do here? What are we trying to be? How are we going to be systemic, rather than seeing something as a job done system changed. So you're saying, what do we mean by this? Like, what are we talking about? And I think that's where it's often easier to not use the word and say, take the word systems change and put it outside the room or outside the organization, and really understand, like, what are we trying to achieve and how do we go about it in a inclusive, systemic way. But I think terms can get misused, but I think also there might be the right place for a disruption. There's always those moments where those things accelerate change and are the right place. I think there's no right or wrong. That makes but I think creating a new system is a myth. We can't just get an eraser out and erase what we've got and say it doesn't really work, because we can't see all the parts. If you think about I don't know, give me an example of something that we're trying to tackle, and we can't just erase it and build something new over there and then bring it in. So I think there's about
so today it was food systems. Was one of the many that I've talked about today, but it was food and agricultural systems. And that conversation was about this mindset shift. But what was really interesting to me was that it was a very high level conversation, and people, they were talking about indigenous or farmers and feminine energy and consciousness, but none of the people in the room were from necessarily, well, there was a Buddhist monk, which was quite cool, but there was it's like, where are the people, where are the doers in this room? If we're talking about an agricultural system and we're all talking about it in this high level way about what needs to shift, but it didn't feel necessarily like an inclusive conversation. So it felt like not all the parts were in the room, and it was this conversation about people over there, but not including them in the chats. And I feel that's really common in my world. And I feel like I'm the one I feel like I'm one of the lonely voices saying, sorry, love, you need to bring some people in to understand these different parts.
Yeah.
So I don't know what you think about that, but.
Well, I think even that is, we've got many, I can see many people on this call are kind of, social designers and human-centered designers, or, whatever term we use, who are, working with, bringing people into processes who are experiencing the challenge or are more closely connected to it. But I think it is challenging in a business environment to often have all the stakeholders around the room. But it's also the kind of a picture of systems change or working systemically, where you might have a conversation in one area, but you might not have all the stakeholders involved, and you're going to have people working at different points in that system and at different paces, because it's very hard to all act together. And I think it's very challenging to be inclusive when those things take more time. But there is a kind of other side to that, where I've certainly heard of people who have worked in organizations and they've had a really negative experience of, say, systems thinking or systems change, because, in swoops a consultant and kind of others them. And it's sort of, here's a really complicated causal loop diagram we've drawn. And then they're sort of baffled by it and they don't know what to do with it. And I think there's a kind of real challenge in actually the methods being, kept on a shelf over there, and how do you bring them in and make them inclusive, like you would do in, I know there's some designers here, like you would do in kind of mapping a user journey or making it really collaborative.
And so can I ask about so that's made me think, I'm conscious of time, but it's made me think about the different layers of of what we're talking about and at what level, because a lot of the people that I'm working with are thinking, global systems. So it's like the global agricultural system needs sorting out. but actually there are a multitude of different systems existing within that framework, and actually you've got different components at different levels. Does that, so it's, where's that systemic change happening, and how do they all weave together to create a change that's a society that's more equitable, or more inclusive and less exploitative, which would be my desire in life. But
yeah, I guess with all of those, so models, or just referencing here, there's something called Donatello Meadows leverage points, and there's something also called the iceberg model. But what they both have in common is the deeper you go down, like the scale, when you get to the mindsets and beliefs right at the core of the bottom, that's where bigger change happens. It's easier to kind of make changes on the edges where you're just kind of changing a number, a stock, or a flow, or you're kind of creating something new. But really what you want to do, and what the iceberg shows, so imagine a literal iceberg in the ocean, you've got only 10 or 15% on the top, and that's kind of what you see. That's your kind of cause, that's your event. But beneath that, you've got patterns and trends. So what's going on? What's underlying that? What are the patterns that's caused that to happen? And beneath that, you've got underlying structures. So what's underpinning those patterns? And then deeper beneath that, you've got the mindsets, the mental models. And so what often is helpful, and actually I had a class with some students this morning, is we use the iceberg model to question their projects. And it was really helpful in thinking, like, what's the problem on the surface I'm looking at here? And even if it wasn't a complex one, it helps think about, where am I intervening? Am I actually responding to those patterns or trends? Or am I just responding to the event on the surface, or am I really trying to shift a deeper mindset or paradigm around, so right at the bottom of the iceberg, right deep in the ocean, where it's our view of say, a young person who's been involved in crime. What are the reasons, or county lines we hear about? Like, what are the reasons why that's happened, and how can we change our mindsets and those that work around them to actually see them not as a criminal, but as a victim who's been exploited themselves? So is that kind of like, how do we tip that towards the deeper?
And that's really interesting to me. So like, when you're talking to students, like you were saying that you're talking to students earlier today, how do you cultivate a mindset of systems thinking rather than systems change obsession?
Yeah, I keep there's no short answer, and I think I'd love to show you diagrams, but it's a journey. And I think that kind of the aha moments come when you're working on something that you're really personally motivated by. And the aha moment for anyone, for me, was like when I saw that deeper shift, or when I kind of connected to that mindset behind, why would I want to change the patterns? Why would I want to work on the trends and what's occurring beneath the structure? And I think it's just a mindset that often is a bit like design thinking. There's many design thinkers here. It's just taking it a bit deeper and thinking about the whole and whole systems, as opposed to parts. But I don't think there's a quick answer, actually. And that's the more tricky thing, I think, is it takes practice, and it's something that you have to kind of constantly evolve. And it's something that people, really step up to when they see that this helps them, or helps the thing they're working with. It's just, there are really broken systems, and I think this is not about saying, be patient and kind of, tiptoe around things that are fundamentally broken. And ultimately, like, this is why I guess many of us are here today, is actually we work in areas that we really care about, and we wouldn't be doing it if we didn't care. So I think there's so many levels to that you take on an approach. But it comes back to, I think Emily mentioned earlier, like, how can you bring people on the journey while creating a safe space, a container for challenge to be heard? And that's not, the colonialists are challenging you back. That's actually about, challenging it. How do you get those people there? But maybe just before I kind of love to hear from a few others not spoken before we kind of end, is that just something that came up for me today that kind of really kind of again like went, yeah, is this quote that Jean Bolton said, which was around kind of that top down, bottom up kind of narrative that we often hear, you know, you need a leader in an organization to decide on the change. Well, as we've seen in the last year, decade, you know, world events happen and we've got movements and people galvanize around an issue and change happens. And there's something that she said about a system creates the architecture it needs from the bottom up. And I think that kind of really speaks volumes for the kind of journey and the kind of galvanizing that actually happens at a kind of grassroots or at a kind of action level. And that kind of almost like creates that tipping point, you know. Deep is looking.
No, I'm nodding.
Yeah. So it's, you know, we don't need like the president to sign off that we're going to end one system and start another. There's a thing about, you know, the system creates what it needs, how actions are living out in it. So I think that kind of, you know, stepping into it and joining that journey is actually part of that kind of ripple effect.